There are people who get sober and stay sober every day. And we have research to show what they do to accomplish this. Hello, welcome. My name is Troy Faddis, and this is my colleague.
Hi, this is Dr. Maddie Liebing.
And we're going to present today on what are 9 keys that successful people, or people who are in recovery, do to stay sober. So these keys, they are empirically based. We have more observational data, we have more experimental data, and we have more population sizes than ever to help us know what are the things that are most likely to lead to us staying in recovery long term. And the research doesn't all come from just the world of substance abuse. It also comes from research around depression and anxiety, and even a lot of research coming from couples therapy and from family therapy. In fact, when we get to the end, we find that family therapy is actually one of the most critical keys in helping someone stay in recovery. Hopefully you can just freeze the screen if you want to look at it. I don't want to spend too much time with it, but here's a lot of great resources that where the information we're going to talk about today comes from.
And just so you know, I'm going to be putting together a handout from the slides that we're going to be looking at. And I like to do the handout after you've had a chance to see it rather than having you look at the handout before we have the presentation. So those resources will be on that handout. So you won't have to worry about trying to get a copy of that. We'll be emailing that to you this week.
So I started this, probably about 12 years ago. I was assigned to work with an older adolescent group. They're 17 to 18-year-old young men who are all in primary diagnosis of substance use, and I wanted to learn how to treat them better. And so I started doing this research. And the research was looking at the data, the meta-analysis, the journal articles, but it was also looking for mentors, talking to people who were experts in the field and learning from them. In fact, some of the stuff we'll talk about today comes from those mentors, like Dr. Kevin McCauley and others who specifically helped me learn more about being in recovery. But the third place I got this information from was the clients that I worked with. I learned more from them than maybe anywhere else, and not just learning from them prior to recovery, but learning from them as they were starting to live a life of recovery. I'm forever thankful for all of those sources of information. And I started compiling a list. And it started out with probably 4, but it grew quickly to 7. I now today have 9, and I try to keep it there, but there's always new information. And so I'm trying to get all that new information continuously to fit in this framework. I did not purposely put them in order of most important, because I don't think that there's necessarily one key that's more important than the other. But I did put them in order of where I think we will start. And I think that people start by having a reason to be sober and then developing into a purpose. What is my purpose for staying sober? There's a lot of examples of this. Dr. John Gottman talks about in couples therapy, if we're going to repair injuries and have a happy marriage, we need to have a shared vision. There's research from American Airlines that has a recovery program just for their pilots. And after 7 years, 87% of them are still sober. And why? I think it's because pilots love to fly. Like, there's nothing that matters more to them than the thrill of being able to fly. That's part of their identity. And that matters more to them than their desire to use. So being able to have a reason is where I think we have to start. Maddie, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to just jump in, and it might start with family therapy, because family therapy is number 9 on our list, but it might be through the recognition that you're in a place of, like, some of the guys I've worked with is their fear was they're going to lose their family, they're going to lose their wife and their kids, or they're going to lose the connection that they have with their parents and their siblings, and so yeah, but it still has to roll around to this one, because if they don't have a purpose for making a change, they're not going to make the change. And I think that's the main thing that we see at Legacy is, so why are you here? What's happening in your life is sort of like the kind of the core of therapy is, what are you doing? How's that working for you? And what do you want to do about it? Those 3 things are really the essence of therapy, and for making major change in your life. And what happens when they come here is that they go, my lifestyle has not been working for me. I don't want to keep doing it. I don't want to keep living like this. This is not okay. And so they have to have a reason and a desire to make the change and make that commitment to be able to stay. And I like the idea of including the depression cure in this list too, because what that requires is a lifestyle change, of creating balance for yourself in your life, to make sure you have all the elements that are going to keep you in a happy and healthy state, and in the process not be using in order to be able to deal with depression or anxiety, because you're doing the things that are going to actually get at. I saw a thing from a parent the other day, and she was saying, I'm sorry, this is to her son, I'm sorry that I didn't that I used a substance, instead of actually dealing with the anxiety and the depression. And I think that's where they start to get to a place of going, I've got to do something different, and I've got to have a purpose and a reason for changing in my life and having that commitment.
Yeah. I have found that this changes over time, though. And it's okay.
Sure.
But I found at the beginning, most people, the reason why, their reason, their purpose, is usually about what they're going to lose or the pain that has caused them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the way it's supposed to be. I think that until we have enough of a reason, like we might call it a rock bottom. Dr. Abraham Tversky, in his book Addictive Thinking, talks about this mental shift when we start to see substance use as having distress, instead of seeing substance use as the romanticized longing that we often feel about it. And I think that that's a good indication. Like when we first stop using, it's because of everything we've lost, we've had to sacrifice, of people we've hurt, and our own hurt. However, it grows. I think it has to. I think for it to have lasting power, it ends up becoming something positive, like what we're reaching for, what we have the potential to gain, what we're, like the pilots, they want to fly. And for a lot of people, actually, I think it can be something spiritual. It doesn't have to be. It can also be something just like the connections between you and I. It could be about maybe as a new career, or the idea that the science works and I believe in it. I think that's what step 2 is. What am I going to put my hope into? That's the principle behind step 2 is hope. So what do I put my hope in? But I think for a lot of people, and some research shows this, when they have a spiritual connection to this level of purpose, they tend to have a stronger sense of purpose, and this tends to show up stronger in their recovery.
And sometimes it seems like for quite a few people, sometimes that purpose becomes a desire to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's been cool, I think, at working at Legacy is that a lot of our guides were clients here. And they maintained their sobriety for long enough time that they were able to come back and work as a guide, and then they share their story, and so their purpose becomes helping other people to stay on the path that they're on, and
Yeah.
that's why sponsors work in AA meetings and stuff like that. The
It's
purpose
their work, give back.
give back.
And I don't want this to be just all cognitive, like here's a bunch of information, do it, but to really like think about, I don't know how many of you spend time doing like imagery, daily imagery in your life, but you probably all have symbols in your life, whether it's a wedding ring, like that wedding ring is a symbol. And what does it symbolize for you? Maybe in your house or in your office, you have a favorite picture or a little statue. I know I have a little statue that my wife and I had on the top of our wedding cake. And it sits in our hallway right here in the front hallway, and it has our anniversary date on it. And that statue has meaning for our whole family. But do we have this strong sense of purpose? There's a story once told, a small town here in southern Utah, there was during the Korean War, there was a platoon sergeant, and he was over this group of 50 holding this line. And the technology they had back then is he had this line, I don't remember how many stations, but there was many stations. They'd call him in every 15-minute interval. So he spent, and I don't know if it was a week or 2 weeks or however long it was, he personally answered the phone every time that they would call in, and if they missed a call, he knew the line had been broken, and that's where he would send reinforcements. Someone asked him, how did you stay awake? Like the calls were coming in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How did you stay awake? And he says, I pictured myself walking down the streets of my hometown in Richfield, Utah, and facing the parents of a young man who had been killed because I had fallen asleep. And that image in my mind kept me awake. And that's the type of thing I'm looking for, like, that we need to have, and we need to remember it almost constantly at the beginning to help us counteract the other parts of our brain that are going to tell us to use. So having a reason is where we probably are going to start on our road to recovery.
I was going to say something, if you want to roll back real quick on that. And I think that it's important to note that, that having a purpose is a journey, not a destination. In fact, you sometimes don't even know what the destination is. It's the act of being in process of pursuing this purpose, and not knowing necessarily what it's going to look like in the end, but feeling that need to pursue that and to follow that. I like what the talks about a vision quest is that your gifts and strengths plus your willingness to serve, equals purpose, and so it's an active word, not a destination, not an end place, but a way of living that it becomes because of the way that you are pursuing whatever it is that's most important to you. I just talk a lot of times to our guys and ladies about just having a passion in life, a passion that you want to follow, and something that's going to that'll contribute to your life and to those around you as well. And it will be something that you can stay on that journey for a long time. But recognizing that sometimes there's turns in the journey, it might be a little bit different when you get to the end than what you thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm. When I wrote this originally, it was a presentation I did a little while ago. We called it a vision quest. Today we call it a rite of passage or an ROP. And another example that often happens during ROP for our clients at Juniper Canyon and at Legacy is that during their time on the rites of passage, they often will fast. And hunger is a natural appetite, just like a craving to use often is a natural appetite. And having a reason, like going into a fasting situation with an intention. I'm fasting for this reason. I want this experience. That's the power of a purpose, is if that purpose is strong and we keep it in the forefront of our thinking, it can help us overcome the desire for hunger. If that's not there and food's available, we're going to eat. And that's the power of having a reason for something. And that's true in whatever recovery we're from, whether it's our substance abuse or it's working on our depression. The second is we cannot do this alone. We need help, but more importantly than just help, we need accountability. And so it's not just having people around us, and it's definitely not having mom and dad be the pop police. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, who in my life am I willing to give the power to? Who do I trust? Trust enough to say, I'm going to believe that you see the warning signs before I do. I'm going to believe that you care about my well-being and my goal, my end goal, maybe better than me, and that you have the ability to zoom out and see the big picture when sometimes my brain wants to zoom in. Who am I going to give the power to? So if they say, hey, Troy, I'm seeing some warning signs, I think you should slow down and stop. Even if I don't want to, even if I think they're wrong, I'm going to say, I've already made this decision. I'm going to follow your direction. Let me slow down and stop. And when we have those type of people in our lives, and enough of them that we're being monitored, especially at the beginning, every day, maybe every hour of every day, that's how this becomes an effective key in our lives. And it can be created for you. And maybe sometimes because of your choices, it is created for you legally, parentally, relationally, academically. However, this works best when you're the one offering it up and saying, let me give you this trust.
And we really have to have a support community in order to make this work. And AA has, has been around for a long time, has a lot of research behind it. It's a supported, Sam says supported outcomes. But there are also some other groups, self-help and support groups. One of them is called Smart Recovery. Smart Recovery kind of is based on the idea that you build a relationship, that your main relationship in your life is with a substance. And what you need is not, you can't just take that away, but you're going to replace that with relationships with people who are supportive. And those are people who can tell, they're good enough friends to tell you, the same kind of thing that Troy's talking about when they see you going down the wrong road. And, we'll be there with you, for you, to make that happen. So in Smart Recovery, you invite your friends and family to the meetings with you. And the support community is you and your people and other people's people, and you create these support groups to help each other to be able to stay on course. And it's we're hardwired. We've talked about this. We're hardwired for relationship. If we feel attachment wounds, we feel detached, we feel alone, isolated. You notice one of the signs of addiction is if you're using alone, and you're disconnected even from your using community. That's when you know that they're really going down that addictive path. And so creating that community has to be a huge piece of what we do in order to be able to make this work. And that's one of the things that when guys go or ladies go from our programs to like a transitional living program, they begin to design and learn how to create a recovery community wherever they are, and stepping down into those less restrictive environments, but strengthening those community support, that community of support. Then that's how it makes it possible for them to be able to gradually get more toward independent living. But they're not independent in the sense that they have to still continue to have that relationship in order to be able to stay on the course.
Well, and you guys may remember, maybe not, about 5 years ago, there's a new study that sort of made the rounds on social media. It was on all the morning talk shows and news. They call it the Rat Park Studies. And it was in addition to the 70s, the Dr. Old's rat studies. And it was saying that there's a new added element that they found in their research with these are experimental data. So they're looking at rats who've been, addicted to cocaine. But what they found is that when they put the rats in a different, not in an isolated environment, but in a social environment, but just maybe even more importantly, in a social environment that had an element of fun, of adventure, of creativity, of problem solving, that the rats would choose that type of social interaction in conjunction to having fun over the cocaine, which was in addition to the findings that we saw from Dr. Olds. So I think that it's not just the sociality, it's the type of sociality we're having, but it really is an important feature of recovery. The third key is time. And every person I work with in early recovery has a really hard time with this key because, and maybe so do some of the parents and the family members, because we're all wired to want to get back to the status quo as quick as we can. And so they want to put in, just enough effort to get back to where life is normal and they can move on with school, with work, with normal life. And sometimes their desire to move on so quickly is the Achilles heel in their recovery. The National Institute of Drug Abuse has a lot of meta-analysis data that shows how important time is in recovery. And my goal is to help everyone in early recovery to eventually get to a place of accepting that they need to make their recovery their number one priority. It doesn't have to be their only priority, but their number one priority for at least the next 12 months. Getting us to that year sober date, we are so much more likely to see that continue on to 3 years, to 5 years, to 7 years, to 10 years. If we are not putting the emphasis on learning the steps, integrating the lifestyles, rewiring the brain, takes at least 12 months and sometimes 3 to 5 years, depending on what substance was being used and the method of delivery. Sometimes it takes more than a year for us to rewire the pathways and to have less intense desires to use. So,
and to even have your brain heal, to be able to get the chemicals that are necessary, because you've been replacing the chemicals that make that electrical connection and energy to make the brain work, like the pictures that we've shown in some of our other presentations. And so it takes that long for your body to start producing those the chemicals that we need in order to be able to have a healthy brain, be able to have the electrical activity that we need in order to be able to use our brain the way that we want to. But the hard thing about this, and you're going to say this right now, Troy, is that it has to be, recovery isn't something you just get through so you can get back to your life. It needs to be an ongoing way of being. That's why one of our core values is recovery as a way of being, and it has to be incorporated into your life. And it isn't, it's really hard for me when you say, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict, and you have to say I'm this for the rest of my life. It's the fact that you have a tendency to be in addiction, and that part of you is going to, because you've been there, it's hard to not go back and have that not be a part of your history. And so you need to make sure that you're that this becomes a way of life and not just a 1-year journey. It's a part of you incorporated into.
Well, it can't, as you say, it can't just be time. I mean, it is about time, but it's what you're doing with the time.
Right.
Like you look at the research on, like, say, deliberate practice, or the research on mastery taking 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
How much of a, people want to do their, they may do their time. There's a lot of research around neuroplasticity and like around Parkinson's or MS. And it's not just about like learning to do exercises, but it's being really deliberate. And they're actually doing deliberate mindfulness where they're picturing in their mind, not just with their hands or their feet, but with their minds, like raising their fork up and bringing it to their mouth without shaking, or picking their steps up so they're picking up high enough not to trip. And when they're doing the mindful part of that, not just the physical part of that, it helps regrow neurons. And the same thing's true in recovery. We have to be really deliberate about the steps that we take and picture that in our mind. And we're doing that for 12 months. We're really, truly regrowing new neurons so that we can have a lasting effect. I was thinking, I watch a lot of my clients in treatment even, and they are doing their time, but sometimes I've worked really hard lately on being healthier and losing weight. And I point out to them that I think I'm spending more time in an outpatient setting, preparing food, being mindful about my eating, and exercising as a part-time job, than I see them doing in using their time wisely so that this will stick. The next one is use your strengths. So much psychology. Back to Freud. Freud was a medical doctor, and he specialized in patients who were blind with no medical evidence at the time for their blindness. And that was how he developed his theory of the id, the ego, and the superego. And it was sort of that deficiency, maladaptive. This is how the brain deals with psychological pain and psychological trauma. The field of psychology from then on has mostly been about what's broken. And there are other elements and arms of psychology that's more focused on, well, what's going right. And a lot of recovery research shows that if we're going to see long-term recovery, we need to help individuals truly see what their strengths are, what they're good at, for that to be validated, and for us to get them to use those gifts on a daily and hourly basis so that they can feel that strength within them.
And the idea is that we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, and what we want to do is use our strengths to overcome those weaknesses. I have a story of a teacher. I used to teach a long time ago, and she was working with a client who just could not put together, the senior, so they were well through in their high school years, a paper. And in order to pass this class, had to write a paper on a Shakespearean play. I think it was Hamlet. And they had to analyze something about that. It was a big paper. It was like the whole term. And without that, they wouldn't be able to pass the class, wouldn't be able to graduate. And he was just struggling with it and lots of anxiety in regards to it. So what she did is she brought him a roll of newspaper paper, that's like the tan paper, I don't know what it's called. Anyway, but a big roll of paper. And she gave it to him, and she says, she knew he was really good at art. And she said, here, I know you have a strength in art. Take this paper home and draw Hamlet, and then come and tell me about it. And so he took the paper and he, brought it back, and it was rolled out across the room. And she says, okay, so tell me about the pictures that you picked and why you picked them and what they're important and, how the pieces go together. And so he just started talking about his what am I trying to say? The way that he put this together, why he picked these pictures and how they blend into each other, where the themes were as he went through all of these pictures on this great big roll of paper. And when he got done, he didn't know this, but in her pocket, she had a tape recorder. And she pulled out the tape recorder and hit stop. And she says, okay, write this up and you have a report. Because your brain is able to do this, but you do it in a different way. You do it through images rather than words. And for this requirement, you have to use words. So you can take that strength that you have and be able to use that to be able to do the thing that you have to do right now. And to be able to do that, you've got to identify the strengths in the first place and then be creative about how to use those strengths to overcome things that are, that are not as strong.
The trans-theoretical model of change. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with the stages of change. The stages of change comes from this model. Dr. Miller and others at the University of Rhode Island helped develop this, and they studied or used it primarily on those who had an addiction. A lot of their studies are around nicotine and alcohol and weight loss. And they found, and the reason why I wanted to show this to you is at the very top, let me get my little pointer out here. They call this at the very top the decision balance point. And what we find is a lot of people, they work this way up the side here, but they lose momentum and they never quite get to that decision balance point. So they move back, then they move forward and they move back. And for a lot of people in recovery, this is what we see, just this and this. And often it's because they're missing different elements within this pyramid, like maybe their stage of change. And we talked about this in an earlier podcast or a master web class. Maybe they're in pre-contemplation or in contemplation. They haven't really moved out of those stages. They haven't really got to the place of doing action. But oftentimes here, they call this the decision balance point here in this graphic, but this is the benefit cost analysis quadrant. They're always analyzing whether it's worth it or not. Am I going to gain more by changing than I'm going to lose by staying the same? And I think a lot of programs put the emphasis on these. I do that too sometimes. But it's this part over here, the self-efficacy that I'm talking about with this key, is that people may know. I have a lot of people tell me, I know it's not worth it. Like they've had enough experience, they've been doing this for long enough to say, it clearly is not worth it. Well, then why don't they change? And most of the time, it's because they don't believe they can. Being able to know that they have gifts, that they are capable, and that, again, step 2, step 3, that putting their hope in something and working with others, that they can be strong enough to overcome this, and that they're worth overcoming it. When that is in place with the benefit cost analysis, then we come up here. I call these the actions of change. Then we really can start to do the things that are outwardly required to make these changes stick. And that's why, partly why, the strengths part is so important. Oh, Matt, if you want to talk about the flow chart, or should I?
Go for it.
Okay. So in the realm of positive psychology, we talk a lot about, again, my skill level, my capacity for self-efficacy. And here we're saying that's our skill, like my abilities. And this is how difficult is a task. And so a lot of times folks will choose tasks that have low difficulty because they're afraid of growing or exposing their lack of skill. And at times, like the example you gave, Maddie, about the paper, they felt like the difficulty of that assignment was probably over here, extreme anxiety, and their skill level was really low. So anything below this line creates, and there's other categories, but I'm simplifying with this graphic. Everything down here is anxiety producing. And most people, not all, but especially addicts, when they experience anxiety or discomfort, they tend to withdraw and avoid. That's how they cope with anxiety. That's why they like to use, particularly those who are using depressants and painkillers like opiates, heroin, alcohol, the depressants. Their favorite way of coping is by using, because it helps mask and hide the anxiety.
And on the other end, on the boredom side,
yep.
they also use substances to combat boredom, and that's
right.
That's amphetamines.
Exactly. Yep. Those are using cocaine, stimulants, abusing ADHD medication, and actually, I would say even like using hallucinogenics.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Yep. So we can see that, but so they choose the low difficulty, but it's something they have high skills in. I'm sorry. Something they have high skills in, so that they can, not have to like challenge themselves, but they do find it eventually boring. But there's this flow state. I don't know if you've ever been in that place where you're doing the things that you know that you're best at. I like to ask my clients frequently to answer the question, when you are at your very best. And maybe they'll talk about as a student or as an employee, as a son or a daughter, maybe as a mother or father, when I am at my very best. Maybe for some of them, it's like when they're playing sports or being creative with music or art. But I hope you've all had an experience where you're doing the things that you're really best at, and even though maybe you're putting a lot of energy in, it is actually adding energy to you. It's not taking energy away, because you're in that flow state. And the more we can help like clients experience that flow state, the more likely they are to have the strength to resist or even not even have those cravings. And that's one thing I love about the work we do. At first it may feel like a high difficulty, low skill, but things like learning to make a bow drill fire. Most of my guys will never forget their first bow drill fire. Or being able to like make the best shelter in the world and watch a storm roll through and be safe and warm and dry and comfortable and be like, that is so cool that I can do this. Or maybe the first major rappel or canyon trip or something that's been epic in their lives, and like, I can do this. That gives them the sense of efficacy. It is so important in building someone who needs or wants to be in recovery.
I like to, when I'm thinking about this chart, for me, my best example is skiing. Because if I get to triple black diamonds, that's way too difficult. I don't have the skill level, for that. And then I just have a lot of anxiety. The difficulty is too high. But if it's too easy, then I just get bored, and I need to get something that's deeper. So that's maybe because of the way that this flow goes in an angle like that, going the other direction. But when you have a place where the combination of the steepness of the mountain, the type of snow, and my skill level are all combined, it feels like floating. It feels like dancing. It feels like just full expression of yourself. And you can find that in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be, but a lot of times they talk about it quite a bit in sports, when a team's really working together really, really well. But you can also be that way in a relationship with someone that you really care about. And you feel safe, and you feel like you're challenged, you're not bored, and you are at the same time exhilarated, and you find yourself in that flow.
The next key is treat the whole person. A couple years ago, the National Institute of Drug Abuse revised their recommendation to parents seeking treatment for a child. And they ended up with 13 different recommendations, and they were updated from their previous, I think there were 8 or 9 that they had previously had. But one of the ones that they added that I was really influenced by was this one, that we need to treat the whole person. And the research, the outcome data was really compelling. That a lot of times when we're in recovery, we have this mentality, we have had this mentality, and I don't want to and it's okay if we do. I don't want to say we shouldn't, but I think we often have this treat the addiction first. Like we can deal with the other stuff later. And a lot of that has to do with crisis management, and some of that in the crisis moments is probably true. We need a triage. However, as we do treatment, the need to treat the whole person, if we're still just focusing on recovery and not helping them deal with anxiety, the Irish have a saying, everyone focuses on the drink and not the reason for the drink. And that's part of what I think happens sometimes in recovery. We get so focused on their drinking, that we don't stop and say, well, what's going on? Why did they start in the first place? And even though I know the drink has a life of its own now, the reasons that they started, whether it was maybe a social lubricant, and maybe like they're having some social anxiety or just some self-concept issues, or maybe they've had some real trauma in their lives, whether it's like traumatic events within the family, outside of the family. They call it big T, little t, which is like things that are chronically happening to them every single day, their entire lives. Like for a lot of young men who I think experience academic trauma almost every day they go to school, and also big traumas, that they both equally, if not treated, their substance abuse returns.
And I think that's the core. It's the core of what we need to work on. And if we don't get to that core, then anything that we do is not going to be effective. And that's why things like the depression cure are so important. And the understanding some of Brene Brown's ideas about the difference between guilt and shame, and how to live our lives from a place of wholeheartedness. Because we have to have the whole person in order for us to be able to move forward. But what happens is you have something, whatever it is, trauma or ADHD or a learning problem, or a parent who's using substances. There's lots of different things that can be happening, and then the substance is what helps to numb and to not have to feel it, and to avoid it and all that kind of stuff. Then it takes on a life of its own, of the addiction itself. And so you have to stop the using first, because you can't treat somebody's trauma if they're drunk or if they're stoned. And so you've got to stop the using, and that's why residential programs and primary care programs and things like Wilderness are so essential, so that then you can get to those issues, diagnose the issues, and then be able to actually begin to treat the issues. It's really an interesting thing. I do a lot of psychologicals here, and it's an amazing thing that parents will see there's something really wrong, something going really wrong with their child. They'll get them a psychological, and then they'll come here, and they'll be here for maybe it's been a couple of years since they had the psychological, and we'll say, let's look at this again, and I'll test them, and they. The problem is even if they were using on the day that they did the test, they were using kind of consistently through that period of time, and their IQs, their academic skills, everything else is just sliced into much lower. And so when they're clear here, and they've been here long enough that their minds and their brains are clear, they can think better. Their IQs actually go up, 10 to 15 points. I've had really dramatic differences. And what it tells us is that now we have the whole brain operating, and we can begin to treat the things that were underneath the substance use. And so those two pieces have to play in together. And we're going to have to stop because we've got to get on to our other call.
Well, I'll say one more thing before we stop. Okay. Is it's not just about like the co-occurring diagnoses, but it's treating the whole person in all kinds of other ways.
Yes.
A lot of the research was about nutrition. Yep. And a lot of the research was about good exercise. And even Dr. Ilgardi, I hope I said that right, who wrote the Depression Cure book, found a lot of the same things in treating depression, that we need to make holistic lifestyle changes. Like how to eat right is such an important part of recovery. So same with the research around ADHD. Having really important probiotics, good dark green vegetables in our diet is one of the most effective ways to help treat ADHD. Mm-hmm. Same thing as we're finding to be true with treating addiction. So it's not just co-occurring diagnoses, but it's all of the lifestyles around that person. We really need a comprehensive treatment plan.
When we're doing this, like in our curriculum, we talk about the 5 elements of a healthy human being, and we want to strengthen all 5 of those elements: social, emotional, intellectual, physical, and spiritual. And that creates that's how you treat the whole person. And if there's specific areas you have to spend more time on, you do that. But to be able to get that holistic approach generally.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. We will continue.